Barbara Winters had been the president of the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association for 7 years running. At 58, with her perfectly highlighted bob and designer wardrobe, she ruled the suburban neighborhood with unwavering authority. Residents whispered about her militant enforcement regulations, from the precise shade of beige allowed for exterior paint to the maximum height of garden gnomes. Most neighbors simply complied to avoid confrontation, but Barbara took particular pleasure in issuing violation notices, complete with her signature red pen underlines. Her husband Charles, a quiet tax attorney, had long ago stopped trying to temper her zealous approach to neighborhood governance. The morning ritual never varied. Barbara would rise precisely at 6:15 a.m., meticulously apply her makeup and dress in one of her carefully curated outfits, today a navy pantsuit with gold buttons that she felt conveyed the appropriate level of authority. By 7:30, she was perched at her kitchen island, reviewing her neighborhood spreadsheet while sipping her precisely measured black coffee with 1 teaspoon of organic honey. "I see the Andersons still haven't addressed their mailbox tilt," she muttered to Charles, who was hidden behind his newspaper. "That's the 3rd notice this month." Charles lowered his paper slightly, his expression weary. "Perhaps their contractor is delayed, Barbara. Remember when our bathroom renovation took 3 extra weeks?" She dismissed his comment with a wave of her manicure hand. "Rules exist for a reason, Charles. Consistency is what maintains our property values." She tapped a perfectly polished nail on another line in her spreadsheet. "And I need to check if the Thompsons have finally removed that unapproved bird feeder." Oakwood Estates consisted of 74 homes, each valued between $750,000 and $1.2 million, arranged in meticulous cul-de-sacs with names like Williamsburg Circle and Colonial Court. Barbara had campaigned for the HOA presidency after receiving a violation notice herself for Christmas lights left up 2 days past the January 2nd deadline. Rather than simply complying, she decided to take over the system, initially promising a more reasonable approach before gradually imposing even stricter regulations than her predecessor. By 9 a.m., Barbara was conducting her Tuesday property inspection, clipboard in hand, designer sunglasses perched on her nose despite the overcast day. She walked with purpose, stopping occasionally to photograph evidence with her phone. A trash can visible from the street, a basketball hoop mat stored in a garage, decorative rocks that hadn't been approved by the aesthetic committee, which she also chaired. Mrs. Gonzalez, watering her immaculate flower beds, quickly retreated indoors when she spotted Barbara approaching. The elderly woman had received 3 violation notices last summer for planting red geraniums instead of the approved pink or white varieties. "Good morning," Barbara called with artificial cheer, making a show of examining the flowers with approval. "Much better color choices this year." Mrs. Gonzalez offered a tight smile through her window but didn't emerge again. Barbara's power in the community extended beyond the HOA. She served on the PTA, although her children were grown, organized the annual charity gala that was more social pageantry than fundraiser, and held a position on the country club membership committee. Her social circle consisted primarily of 5 women who shared her values about maintaining standards, women who benefited from Barbara's selective enforcement and who voted as a reliable bloc at HOA meetings. As she rounded Sycamore Lane, Barbara spotted a moving truck in front of the Miller's old Colonial. The property had been vacant for 3 months, ever since John Miller's job transfer. Barbara quickened her pace, eager to assess the new additions to her domain. "Excuse me," she called to a mover carrying a coffee table. "I'm Barbara Winters, HOA president. Are the new owners here?" Before the man could answer, Barbara was already climbing the porch steps, neighborhood welcome packet in hand. The packet contained the 47-page HOA rulebook, with the most commonly violated rules highlighted, architectural review forms in triplicate, and a fridge magnet with her contact information for any neighborhood concerns. What the packet didn't mention was how Barbara had driven away 3 families in the past 2 years alone through her relentless enforcement, or how the HOA legal fees had doubled under her leadership due to disputes she insisted on pursuing. It didn't mention the secret Facebook group where half the neighborhood vented their frustrations but feared speaking out publicly. The Paddles moved into the Colonial on Maple Drive in early spring. Priya, a pediatric surgeon, and Raj, a software engineer, had saved for years to afford a home in the school district for their 2 children. Within days of moving in, Raj began planting a vegetable garden in their backyard, a family tradition and a way to teach their children about their Indian heritage through growing traditional ingredients. The garden was barely visible from the street, tucked behind a tasteful lattice fence that matched the neighborhood aesthetic. 12-year-old Arjun and 9-year-old Leela Patel raced around their new backyard, breathing in the fresh suburban air so different from their cramped apartment in the city. The moving boxes were still half unpacked inside, but Raj had prioritized starting the garden, a piece of his childhood in Gujarat that he was determined to recreate for his children. "Dad, can I plant the cilantro seeds?" Leela asked, her small hands already covered in rich soil. Of course, Beta, Raj smiled, showing her how to space the seeds properly. Your grandmother used this same cilantro in her cooking. When these grow, we'll make her special chutney recipe. Priya watched from the back porch, still in her hospital scrubs after a 12-hour shift. The family had sacrificed for years to afford this home, taking extra shifts, limiting vacations, and putting aside any luxury so their children could attend the top-rated schools in Oakwood Estates. The property had stretched their budget to its absolute limit, but seeing her family's joy made every penny worth it. I met one of the neighbors today, Priya called to Raj. Mrs. Chen from next door brought over homemade cookies. She seemed lovely. That's great, Raj replied, looking up from the neat rows he was creating. Did you mention we're planning a small housewarming once we're settled? Before Priya could answer, the doorbell rang. She straightened her hair and hurried through the house, opening the front door to find an impeccably dressed older woman with a folder clutched to her chest. Hello there, the woman said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I'm Barbara Winters, president of the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association. You must be Mrs. Patel. Dr. Patel, actually, Priya corrected gently. But please call me Priya. Barbara's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Doctor, how nice. I brought your welcome packet with all our community guidelines. We pride ourselves on maintaining certain standards here in Oakwood. Priya accepted the heavy folder. Thank you. We're excited to be part of the community. We chose Oakwood specifically for the schools and the beautiful neighborhood. Yes, well, we work very hard to keep it beautiful, Barbara replied, peering past Priya into the foyer where moving boxes were stacked. I notice your husband has already started some digging in the backyard. The question carried an unmistakable edge that made Priya straighten her posture. Yes, we're putting in a small vegetable garden. It's a family tradition. Barbara's eyebrows rose slightly. I see. Well, you'll want to review Section 12B of the Landscaping Guidelines before proceeding too far. All exterior modifications require committee approval. It's just a vegetable garden, Priya explained, behind the existing lattice fence. But we'll certainly review the guidelines. As they spoke, Arjun and Leela appeared behind their mother, curious about the visitor. Barbara gave them a cursory glance before continuing. Children, how nice. The Thompsons at the end of the block have a boy about your age, she said vaguely, though the Thompson boy was at least 3 years older than Arjun. I should mention that we do have noise ordinances for playtime hours, all in the packet. After Barbara left, promising to check in soon, Priya leafed through the extensive guidelines with growing concern. Rad joined her, wiping soil from his hands. Everything okay? He asked, noticing her expression. I'm not sure, Priya replied, turning pages filled with restrictions. The HOA president seemed particular. Later that evening, as the family ate dinner among half-unpacked boxes, the Paddles' neighbor Frank Weber stopped by to introduce himself. I see you've met our local dictator, he joked after Priya mentioned Barbara's visit. Is she always so? Raj searched for a diplomatic word. Intense? Controlling? Absolutely, Frank confirmed. My advice? Document everything, follow the rules to the letter, and maybe join the online neighborhood group. The unofficial one, not the official HOA one. I'll text you the link. As the Paddles settled into their new home over the next few days, they couldn't help but notice Barbara's silver Lexus slowly cruising past their house, or her figure visible through their front windows, clipboard in hand, making notes as she conducted her inspection. When Barbara spotted the garden during her weekly property standards inspection, she immediately drafted a violation notice citing unauthorized agricultural activity and non-conforming landscape elements. Despite the garden falling well within the property's boundaries and meeting all local ordinances, Barbara argued it violated the spirit and character of Oakwood Estates. She delivered the notice personally, informing the Paddles they had 72 hours to remove the garden or face daily fines of $100. When Priya politely requested to see the specific bylaw prohibiting vegetable gardens, Barbara's dismissive response was captured on the Paddles' doorbell camera. Barbara's Wednesday morning coffee with her inner circle, Diane, Maureen, Patricia, and Judith, was abuzz with discussion about the newcomers to Oakwood. They seem nice enough, Maureen ventured cautiously. My husband says Dr. Patel is quite respected at Memorial Hospital. Barbara stirred her coffee with deliberate precision. Professional accomplishments aside, there are standards to be maintained. I drove past yesterday and saw them digging up half their backyard for some kind of farm. A farm, Diane echoed with appropriate horror. Well, a vegetable garden, Barbara conceded, but it's extensive and completely unauthorized. Is there actually a rule against gardens? Patricia asked, immediately shrinking under Barbara's sharp glance. Section 12B clearly states that all landscaping must maintain the colonial aesthetic of the neighborhood, Barbara recited from memory. Vegetable gardens are hardly colonial, are they? By noon, Barbara had composed a violation notice on official HOA letterhead. She took particular care with the wording, citing 3 different sections of the bylaws and emphasizing potential daily fines. The truth that none of the cited sections explicitly prohibited vegetable gardens was a detail she considered irrelevant. Most residents capitulated rather than challenge her interpretation of the rules. At 5:30 p.m., when she knew both petals would likely be home, Barbara marched up their front walkway, violation notice in a sealed envelope. She pressed the doorbell, unconsciously adjusting her posture to maximize her authority. Raj opened the door, still in his work clothes but with traces of soil under his fingernails. His warm smile faltered slightly upon recognizing their visitor. "Mr. Patel," Barbara began without preamble, "I'm here on official HOA business." She extended the envelope. "This is a violation notice regarding the unauthorized garden installation in your backyard. The HOA requires all exterior modifications to receive prior approval." Raz's expression shifted from confusion to concern as he scanned the document. "But this is just a small vegetable garden. It's not even visible from the street." "Visibility isn't the issue," Barbara countered. "The issue is compliance with neighborhood standards, Section 12B clearly. What's happening?" Priya appeared behind her husband, still in her surgical scrubs. "We've apparently violated HOA rules with our garden," Raj explained, handing her the notice. Priya quickly read the document, her medical training evident in her calm assessment. "This says we have 72 hours to remove the garden or face $100 daily fines, but doesn't cite any specific prohibition against vegetable gardens." "Section 12B, Barbara began again. "I've read Section 12B, Priya interrupted politely. "It addresses aesthetic harmony, but doesn't specifically mention gardens. Could you point to the exact bylaw that prohibits growing vegetables?" Barbara's cheeks flushed slightly. "The interpretation of the bylaws falls to the HOA board, which I chair. We've determined that vegetable gardens don't align with neighborhood standards." News of the garden dispute spread rapidly through neighborhood social media. Several longtime residents, tired of Barbara's overreach, quietly reached out to the paddles offering support. Others, part of Barbara's loyal circle, began scrutinizing the paddles' every move. Charles warned his wife that the garden violation seemed legally dubious, but Barbara doubled down, convinced that maintaining strict control was essential to preserving property values. She scheduled an emergency HOA board meeting, expecting her usual rubber stamp approval. The unofficial Oakwood Estates Facebook group, Oakwood Neighbors Real Talk, exploded with activity the evening after Barbara delivered the violation notice. Frank Weber had shared a sanitized version of events, careful not to directly quote the doorbell camera footage but making the situation clear. "Another homeowner targeted for Barbara's personal crusade," his post began. "New family on Maple being fined for a backyard vegetable garden that violates no actual bylaws." Comments appeared almost immediately. "She threatened to fine us for our son's treehouse last summer, demanded we remove a structure that had been there for 15 years. Jennifer McAllister, classic Barbara. "Remember when she tried to stop the Yoshidas from installing solar panels? Even though state law specifically protects homeowners' rights to solar energy." Mike Rodriguez, "Maybe we should all plant vegetable gardens. She can't fine everyone." Sarah Thompson, "But Barbara's supporters were equally vocal. The HOA rules exist for a reason. Our property values depend on consistent enforcement." Diane Wallace, "If we allow one exception, where does it end? Chicken coops, broken down cars on blocks." Maureen Fletcher, "Barbara herself didn't see the Facebook group. She'd been blocked years ago, but her loyal followers reported back. That evening, she paced her immaculate living room while Charles watched silently from his leather recliner. "It's completely out of control, Charles," she fumed. "Weber is stirring up trouble again. I knew we should have fined him more aggressively for that unapproved fence stain." Charles folded his newspaper carefully. "Barbara, I've looked at the bylaws. There's nothing that specifically prohibits vegetable gardens." "Don't you start too," she snapped. "It's about precedent. Today it's vegetables, tomorrow who knows what they'll try to grow." "They're a doctor and an engineer with 2 children, not commercial farmers," Charles pointed out mildly. "And exotic plants is dangerously close to language that could be interpreted as—" "I never mentioned their background," Barbara interrupted defensively. "This is purely about property values and neighborhood aesthetics." The next morning, Barbara noticed 3 neighbors chatting with Raj as he worked in the controversial garden. Her loyal foot soldier Diane immediately texted her. McAllister, Chen, and Weber, all at the paddles. Chen brought plants. Barbara immediately emailed the 4 other HOA board members, calling for an emergency session. "Significant covenant violations threatening neighborhood character require immediate board action," she wrote, confident in their support. 3 of the 4 had consistently voted with her for years, more interested in maintaining their own property values than challenging her authority. By mid-afternoon, battle lines were clearly drawn. While Barbara worked the phones rallying her supporters, Priya and Raj received a steady stream of visitors. Mrs. Chen brought heirloom tomato seedlings. The Hendersons dropped off gardening tools. Sarah Thompson offered legal contacts who specialized in HOA disputes. Most surprising was the visit from Eleanor Simmons, the 82-year-old neighborhood matriarch who had lived in Oakwood since its founding. "My late husband was on the original HOA board," she told the Patels as she settled onto their porch swing. "This nonsense about gardens would have appalled him. The original covenants were about preventing commercial development, not stopping families from growing tomatoes." The typically empty HOA meetings suddenly overflowed with residents. Barbara arrived early, confident in her position, only to find the community room already packed. When she presented the Patel case, she was stunned when Raj stood up with a folder of documentation. He calmly presented the HOA bylaws, which contained no prohibition against gardens, along with a letter from a real estate appraiser stating that tasteful vegetable gardens actually increase property values. Several neighbors spoke in support of the Patels, including Mrs. Henderson, a 30-year resident who revealed she maintained a small herb garden for decades without issue. For the first time, Barbara watched as the board voted against her recommendation. The Oakwood Estates Community Center hadn't seen such attendance in years. By 6:45 p.m., 15 minutes before the emergency meeting was scheduled to begin, every folding chair was filled. Residents stood along the walls and spilled out into the hallway. Barbara's stomach tightened as she surveyed the crowd from the doorway. "This is highly irregular," she murmured to Diane, who hovered anxiously at her elbow. "Most of these people never attend meetings." "The Facebook group," Diane whispered back. "They've been organizing." Barbara squared her shoulders and marched to the front of the room. She arranged her materials meticulously on the table, the violation notice, carefully highlighted copies of the HOA bylaws, and photos of the Pavel's garden taken with her telephoto lens from the street. At precisely 7:00 p.m., she called the meeting to order with 3 sharp raps of her gavel. "Due to an urgent covenant enforcement issue, the board has convened this special session," she announced, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "We have a single agenda item regarding a violation at 427 Maple Drive." She nodded to Martin Graves, the HOA secretary, who dutifully recorded the minutes of each meeting while rarely contributing to the discussion. "Before we begin, I'd like to remind everyone that while homeowners may observe board meetings, only board members may vote on enforcement actions," Barbara continued. "We'll allow brief comments from affected parties only." A hand shot up from the middle of the room. Eleanor Simmons, leaning on her cane but radiating the dignity of her 82 years. "Point of order," the elderly woman called out. "According to Article 4, Section 3 of our bylaws, any homeowner may request a special hearing for disputed violations with full speaking privileges." Barbara's smile tightened. "Mrs. Simmons, while that's technically correct, I believe the Patels have requested such a hearing," Eleanor continued implacably, "and I move that we hear their case fully before any enforcement vote." Tom Edwards, the sole board member who occasionally opposed Barbara, seized the opportunity. "I second the motion." Trapped by her own rigid adherence to procedure, Barbara had no choice but to call a vote. It passed 3-2, with Tom and, surprisingly, Rebecca Liu siding with Eleanor's motion. Barbara's faithful ally James Fletcher provided her second vote, but Martin unexpectedly abstained, claiming a need to hear all the facts. When Raj Patel approached the front of the room, Barbara expected an emotional plea. Instead, he set up a small projector connected to his laptop and distributed folders to each board member. "Thank you for this opportunity," he began with calm professionalism. "I'd like to address the violation notice systematically." What followed was a methodical dismantling of Barbara's case. Raj displayed the actual. Humiliated but undeterred, Barbara began a personal crusade against the Patels. She photographed their property daily, filed complaints about their garbage bin placement, and even reported their children's basketball hoop to the city code enforcement. What Barbara didn't realize was that her increasingly erratic behavior was being documented by multiple neighbors. Her turning point came when she entered the Patels' backyard without permission to take close-up photos of the garden, trespassing that was captured clearly on security cameras. When confronted by Raj, she shouted racially charged comments that multiple neighbors overheard. The morning after the board meeting, Barbara sat at her kitchen island, coffee growing cold beside her as she stared unseeingly at her laptop. Charles had already left for work, his goodbye kiss on her cheek briefer than usual. The previous night, he'd attempted a gentle conversation about choosing battles wisely, which she shut down immediately. "They haven't seen the last of me," she muttered, opening a new spreadsheet titled 427 Maple Dar, Ongoing Violations. The defeat at the emergency meeting had awakened something in Barbara that overrode her usual calculated approach to neighborhood control. This had become personal. Over the next 2 weeks, Barbara established a new routine. Each morning at 7:15 a.m., she would drive slowly past the Patholes' home, documenting any potential violations with her phone camera. Each evening at 6:20 p.m., she would repeat the surveillance. She created a detailed log of every observed activity: garbage bins left at the curb 30 minutes past collection time, a garden hose not fully wound on its reel, children's bicycles briefly left on the front lawn. "Have you considered that this might be crossing a line?" Charles asked one evening, finding her hunched over printouts of Oakwood's municipal codes. "I'm simply enforcing the rules that apply to everyone," Barbara replied without looking up. "If they want to live here, they have to comply like everyone else." Charles sighed. "The difference is you're not monitoring everyone else with hourly drive-bys."